welcoming me here today. I have driven down from Hull, so another flood-prone, flood-risky place to come here. And I will say that most of my talk today is kind of based around Hull and the work I've been doing in Hull, but I'm really excited to hear from you afterwards. And I hope to speak for kind of 35, 40 minutes, just so we've got plenty of time at the end to talk to each other and for you to ask me questions and also for me to hear some more about your experiences here. So I am a historical geographer, sometimes a historian, depends on who's asking. But I primarily work on the Risky Cities project at the University of Hull. And I should say that this paper, it's presented by me, but kind of on behalf of the broader team. We're a collaborative, interdisciplinary project, which means that we have historians, we have geographers, we have scientists, and we have people that do kind of community work. So we like to do things together as a team. So I've popped everybody's name on there. And the research I'm drawing on is very much a kind of team effort. So I will just start by introducing the Risky Cities project as a kind of framework for the paper, and then I will tell you what I'm going to talk to you about today. So next slide, please. We're doing it Chris Whitty style. Here we go, a lockdown joke. Oh, maybe not. I will start talking and hopefully it will appear. There we go. Okay, so the Risky Cities project was a UKRI, which is a kind of government funding body. It's a UKRI funded arts and humanities project that used creative and arts-based to talk about climate and flooding with people in Hull. So what you can see here on this slide is just a very small selection of pictures from what was a very big project, where we, for example, ran creative workshops. You can see here in the bottom right, using textiles. We ran workshops in archives, that's the top right. We also did some work with artists and did kind of big community events as well. That's on the top right. And this project in Hull was motivated by the fact that Hull is a risky city and has experienced some major flooding in recent years. So 2000, no is big date here as well. Yeah. And 2013, a bit more recently, and is kind of increasingly vulnerable to watery hazards in the face of climate change. Again, something that I know will feel familiar to you here. One of the key motivators actually for this project was the fact that there's quite low engagement in Hull with watery hazards. So at the time of the project starting, only 6.6% of Hull's population had signed up to receive the Environment Agency flood alerts. And I won't ask who here signed up to Environment Agency flood alerts, but it was 6.6% compared to more than 40% of the population in nearby Doncaster. So despite Hull having a kind of proportionately higher flood risk, there was a much lower engagement. Now, engagement with Environment Agency flood alerts is one kind of metric of community engagement, but it's a kind of rough indicator, perhaps, that there was a bit of a problem in Hull. So the Risky Cities project pioneered something that we like to call a learning histories approach, which essentially is using local place-based histories and stories as a starting point for collaborative and creative discussions with local communities. So what I want to do today is to do some of that with you. So I will share some of Hull's watery histories with you, and then I will talk about how we use some of that for community engagement. And then at the end, maybe put some questions to you about maybe what that might mean for you living in your own risky place. So in the first part of the paper, I will, next, there we go. We'll start by introducing some things about Hull's medieval and early modern watery history. So it's kind of flood and water, and then some examples of how we use these histories for community engagement. Slide's gone blank, never mind. And then I'm going to move on to talk about an early modern flood event. We've got lots of documents in the archives about this flood event, and I know we're a historical association here, so I wanted to spoil with lots of lovely historical tidbits based on some archival research that me and my colleagues are working on actually at the moment. But I'm going to then link that at the end to think about how we might ask questions about flood risk and governance and responsibility and all those kinds of questions that communities are asking today about flooding, and how we can kind of use history as a way to start those conversations. So all throughout this paper, there's a bit of a mixture of past, present and future. The main content of it that I'm presenting to you is kind of the historical material, but all the way through I'm going to be referring to some of the community work that we did and also invite you to think about what that might mean for the future. So we're kind of moving backwards and forwards through time quite a lot. I hope you'll come with me on that. So let's get started by introducing Hull to you, because I don't necessarily expect everybody here to know all that much about Hull. So can we have the next slide? I hope you all like maps, because this presentation is full of maps. So Hull, we are kind of on the northeast of England, at the kind of confluence of the Humber and the River Hull. That black line down the middle is the River Hull. So Hull has kind of got a very interesting connection with its watery environment. It's got two kind of major bodies of water that affect it. And that position has both been to Hull's benefit and to its problems. So it's a kind of sheltered tidal haven, and that has meant historically it's been quite valuable to the Crown. And to kind of trade routes over to the North Sea. But it also has had some problems. So can we have the next slide too? Now this is a historic map of Hull from 1537, around about. Now, as I said before, medieval Hull and early modern Hull was generally quite a prosperous place. It was important to the Crown. It was responsible for trade links over the North Sea. And also as a kind of military place for the country. But its locations on the banks of both the Humber and the Hull brought some risks. So Hull is actually a town that was born of flood. Its kind of creation came as a result of a big flood event in 1253, which washed away nearby land and resulted in a big kind of flood all the way up the level, which is said to have changed the course of the river and enabled the settlement of Hull. So Hull's kind of very histories and origin stories is embedded in Hull. Now, flooding was not always undesirable in medieval and early modern Hull. Flood brought fertile grazing lands, it improved fertility, but big kind of one-off events like storm surges and tidal floods were a problem. So on this map, you can actually see, you might have already spotted, if you're feeling beady-eyed, some early modern flood defences. Now this needs to be on the ball here on the back. If we can have another click, please. So we have, I did put some arrows on this slide. Okay, you're going to have to trust me that they're there. So down the bottom, if you click it through, we've got some wooden revetments. Just at the bottom on the edge of the Humber, you can see there. They are protecting cannon that are protecting the city, but they're also, there we go. They're also forming a defence. And then we've got the walls along the River Humber, also providing some protection against tidal waters. And then finally, oh, one back, never mind. There we go, earthen banks as well, running along the side of the River Hull. So the kind of need to defend against the sea and the river was very much kind of embedded in the built environment of this period. And if you go to the next slide, which is another map slightly later, next slide, please. You can see, hopefully, some of these flood defences in a bit more detail. I'm actually going to come back to this map in a minute. But if you look up the top there's a kind of flood defences, banks and walls going on there. Now this map, you have to look on your side because it's orientated the other way around. So you have to kind of imagine it the other way up. So if everyone turns their head to the side, then it makes a bit more sense. Basically, the hull is running kind of left or right, but really it should be running up and down. So living in this close relationship with water in early modern Hull shaped the kind of day-to-day life of citizens in the town. Now, I've got lots of examples of this, but one of them is the need to secure clean, good drinking water. So lots of medieval and early modern cities developed infrastructure and governance structures to ensure that their citizens had access to clean and reliable drinking water. Now, this was seen as a priority. It might be a bit surprising. We might assume that at this point, you know, with different kind of understanding about disease and bacteria, but there was kind of knowledge and understanding that clean, good drinking water was important. Hull did not have many wells. It was to do with the nature of it topographically. There was lots of saline intrusion into the groundwater. So Hull then, as is now, had to bring water in from outside, from townships principally lying to the west of Hull. So that meant that maintaining kind of sewers and pipes that would bring the water down was imperative. If you go to the next slide, I've got another lovely map, which is actually a rather beautiful map. It's modern, it's not, well-ish, for a historian, it's modern, 1906, and it shows the watercourses in Hull, the springs, and the kind of path that the different watercourses took. So maintaining this fresh water supply was really important. And we know it was important because the town's governors spent a lot of money on it. A good way to know if something is important. So for example, we see lots of payments in this period in the kind of the bench books, which are the records of the town government, for cleaning the ditches that brought fresh water down. So for example, in 1624, it was ordered that the dyke be dressed from the spring head to the bush dyke because stoppage of the dyke being near grown up in many places. So that's essentially, it's becoming overgrown and it needs to be cleared. There also, next slide. Now this is something I really like, and it's a kind of brings into conversations about kind of local knowledge. This is an order from 1639. It says, Mr. Robert Banks, who's a kind of town engineer, shall inquire and search which way and where the sewer along the walls of this town hath anciently run and been kept for cleansing the town. And James Robinson the elder, John Thurgle, and other old men and women as have anciently known the same. So I liked this partly because it mentions women, which is super unusual in early modern governance documents. But because this is basically saying we need to ask the people what they know about where the water goes. And I can see a few nods here because I imagine this is something that you might have experienced now, that you have knowledge of, you know, where the water goes or where it has gone and where it's changed. So the kind of recognition here from the governors of early modern Hull that people understand the water and kind of seeking to draw on that knowledge, which is interesting. And I did my PhD on early modern women, so I also really like the mention about women. And the next quote, which is from the same set of records, so if we can go to the next slide, again shows the role that ordinary people had in kind of managing water in their town. So this is an order that all the inhabitants of Kingston-Upon-Hull do carry their soil to the walls and lay it there and not elsewhere, and that none do sweep their soil down the channel nor cast it into the streets. So, well, yeah, so this is basically an indication of the role that ordinary citizens had in maintaining their kind of watery environment properly and safely. So this was a legal responsibility. There were quite kind of intense laws, urban laws of this period, about the management of what we might call pollutants, what they might call pollutants, not in the modern sense, but the kind of things where they shouldn't be. So, for example, you could not just chuck your refuge out onto the street. And when it says none do sweep their soil down the channel, that's the kind of watery channel that's running down the centre of the roads, or cast it into the street. So this is a kind of indication of the role that ordinary people had in the management of the watery environment around them. Now, this research is obviously really interesting as a historian, from a historical point of view, learning about the role that ordinary people had in living in this quite complex watery environment. But this is also material that we've gone out and talked to the people of Hull about, to kind of start conversations about what does it mean to live in this environment, which isn't exactly the same as it was in the 17th century, but in some ways the challenges are quite similar. So, for example, we have gone out into communities and spoke to them about Hull's watery histories, some of which I've kind of started to share with you, and then said, oh, what does this mean to you? How do you feel about your relationship with water in the city? And using history as a kind of starting place for that conversation. So next slide, please. I've got for you another map, but this one is a map that was made by a kind of participant in one of our workshops that we ran. So this lady basically took printouts of the two maps that I've already shown you, interlaid them over each other to kind of, actually she's kind of orientated it, so that one's the right way around, and then written on other kind of watery places that are significant to kind of her and the city. So, for example, she's added on the Humber Bridge, which obviously was not there in the 16th century. So this is the kind of example of how thinking about kind of local place-based histories can start up conversations about what does it mean to live in this risky watery environment today. And then I've got yet one more map, I think, for this section on the next slide, which is a really beautiful, actually, textile interpretation of one of the historic maps. So again, we ran some textile workshops, no prior experience required, and over the looms and the thread had conversations about the history of Hull, people's experiences, people's flood experiences, which, as you can imagine, there was quite a few, and reinterpreted and reimagined Hull's histories kind of today. So yes, this is a rather beautiful textile map that was made by one of our ladies. So I'm going to wrap up this section now, and then we'll move on to the flood. But I just kind of want to give you a real brief flavour of some of the work we've done in risky cities, because I think it demonstrates that water was not just important for the geography of Hull. So not just looking at a map and seeing, oh yeah, there's a river there and an estuary there, but it was just a part of day-to-day life. And that was sometimes in the floods, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also it was just in the kind of managing that environment. And actually, lots of the times the floods were not that significant. This was about how do we get water down? How do we manage the sewage? And also that ordinary people, local people, had a role to play in that. And then kind of giving you a few examples of how we've use those histories in community work. But I'm going to move on now, if I have my next slide, please, to talk about a flood, because when we think about watery histories, we think about floods, and I know that's probably fresh in the minds of lots of people here. So yes, let's talk about flood. So this are some images from 2007. Well, not the top right, but the main image and the one on the bottom is from the 2007 flood event, which was caused by heavy rainfall, which we know, as you experience the same here, and also Hull's drain system being essentially unable to cope with the level of rainfall that came down. So we had damage to over 7,000 houses in Hull. And then 2013, a storm surge breached the seawalls and flooded homes adjacent to the Humber. And that tidal barrier, top right, which was built, I think, in the 60s, but in response to frequent flood events in Hull in the 50s, came within a couple of centimetres of overtopping. So potentially inadequate in the future. So Hull, like here, has history of flooding. It's a slightly different watery environment than here, and different kind of lived memories of flooding. But it's very much a city that has experienced floods, and that is the case kind of not just in the early modern period, not just in recent memory. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but we have done some research on 19th and 20th century flood histories in Hull, primarily from newspaper sources. And actually, this is a really good kind of source to use if you're interested in flood histories or just local histories, but a bit daunted by kind of the scope of archives, then newspapers are just such an amazing kind of way into these stories, and particularly for flooding, because we found that you look at government records of flooding, they can be, I say, a bit dry, but not very kind of evocative of people's experiences, but newspapers are wonderful for that. So anyway, this is just one I picked out slightly at random from 1931. Hull shops flooded as a result of terrific thunderstorms. So it's got this a rather kind of amazing image of a horse and cart being driven through floodwaters. And there's a railway bridge that I drive under most days. And this talks about the basements in Hull being flooded. So waitresses had to serve the food on the tables. So they took their shoes off and kind of jumped between the tables, carried on serving lunch despite the flood, and kind of jumping between the tables in order to keep service going. So stories like these are a really good way of starting conversations about flooding and inviting people to share their own memories. It's slightly harder to reconstruct medieval and early modern flood events. And that is actually partly because lots of them probably would have been actually quite insignificant for day-to-day life, because this was a society that was used to flood, that was expected to flood. And therefore, what we found when we kind of accessed the records is it's not always that easy to find flooding in the records, because unless it was something that needed paying for, it wouldn't necessarily get remembered. But we have tried to kind of reconstruct some flood events. Now, I'm going to ask the next slide and apologize in advance for how small this is. Oh my goodness, you're never going to be able to read that. So there are dates on there. And maybe the Zoom crowd is slightly better equipped to read it. If anyone is interested, then feel free to drop me an email and I can email you the flood events. I'm sorry, I thought it was small when I was looking at it on my computer, and then so we have tried to reconstruct flood history of medieval and early modern Hull. Oh, that's a fly. I thought it was nothing. Primarily with kind of documentary sources. So we've looked at sources from local government, sources from the Commissioner of Sewers, who are kind of the predecessors to the drainage boards. Commissioner of Sewers were responsible for managing kind of water and flood at this point. And some kind of patent rolls and other legal documents. So this flood history, if you could in fact see it, is not a history of every time there was flooding in Hull and the region, because actually most flood events probably wouldn't have been recorded. This is instead a record of the kind of higher magnitude, lower frequency events that were probably perceived by contemporaries as problematic or undesirable. So not all flooding at this point would have been seen as problematic or undesirable, but there definitely were floods that were seen like that. So for example, there was a flood in 1349, which breached the town's banks. And there's a couple of floods in the 16th century, which were likely caused by storm surges. There was also some deliberate flooding in Hull. I don't know if you've got any Civil War enthusiasts in the room. But during the English Civil War, when Hull came under siege, they used a tactic that actually was used in the Netherlands as well, of deliberately flooding the grounds around in order to prevent the kind of incursion of royalist soldiers. It was a really effective technique. So it did kind of slow the soldiers to come, but it was not very good for the farmers. So kind of there was a certain period where the land around Hull was probably laid underwater as a result of this deliberate flooding. But a later historian said the roads were covered and the hay crops spoiled. The tillage lay too high for inundation, but all the grasslands would lie waste for some time after the water was drained away. So it was a kind of significant flood event that was actually very much man-made. If we can go to the next slide, please. There we go. Okay, so I've given you all, hopefully it was Janet had them out for me, one of these beautiful zines, which you're all very welcome to take home with you. And in the middle, I didn't put this on the slide because it would have been too small. If you fold it out, is it's a kind of rather beautifully illustrated flood timeline. So this is basically, we gave Louis, our artist, a very dry table, like you've seen, and he turned it into this beautiful timeline of flooding. So that's, I thought it'd be easiest if you just took them away from you, and obviously you can browse the whole thing. And this is a kind of record of flood events in Hull from the 1200s all the way to 2013. So feel free to have a read of that. But for the final part of my paper, I want to just give a kind of case study of one particular flood event, which was a flood that happened in Hull and Drypool in 1646. Now, I don't know if there's anybody here who is familiar with the 1607 floods. I would love to talk to you afterwards. This has some parallels with that flood event. So if you are kind of familiar with that, then you might see some similarities. Oh no, you're spoiling my joke about the deep. So this is a map I shared with you earlier. Drypool is on that kind of that top edge. And the reason I put a picture of the deep up is because if anybody knows Hull, there we go. You might have been to the deep, which is possibly one of the best bits of Hull, which is an aquarium. So the deep is where Drypool was/is. So there's not really that many, there we go, that's the deep. Europe's deepest submarine. So if you've been to the deep in Hull, then you've been to Drypool. So it doesn't really exist today, used to, as a kind of small township. So Drypool was at this kind of edge of the Humber and the Hull, as you can see, which made it very vulnerable to flooding, but it also made it super important because the residents of Drypool were responsible for maintaining the banks that you can see there that were up against the Humber. So it was not a very rich place. It was quite small. It had 14 households in the half tax of 1672. It wasn't particularly wealthy, but they had a really key role in the flood risk management, as we would call it now, of Hull and the wider region. So this sea bank is kind of responsible for protecting Hull from inundation from the North Sea. So this bank was really important, but it was in decay by the kind of mid-17th century. And the Commission of Sewers, as I say, kind of think of them as precursors of the Drainage Board. They were very worried about this. They kind of sensed that it was in decay. So it was described in October 1639 as being very ruinous and in great decay. And in order to fix this problem, they raised extra taxes on the people of Drypool. Now, bear in mind, there's not that many people there, not many households there. They're not very wealthy, and they haven't managed to maintain the banks to this point. So the commissioners deciding we will twice. Actually, a very good move. And what happened in 1646 was, next slide, please. There happened such hideous and mighty winds, both day and night, that they forced up the waves, broke and carried clear away the most of the woodwork of the said banks, and wholly ruinated the same, a thing which came by the mighty power of God, which no power of man can withstand. I will say at this point, I have stolen that picture from the 1607 floods in Gloucester. It is not a picture of the floods in Drypool, but it's a nice picture. So, and it kind of is a local link. So yes, we had, the quote, the date is October, but it's referring to an event in March. So basically what happened was what everybody was worried was going to happen, which is there was a massive kind of sea surge, and it broke through the banks. So they were already in decay and likely to fail, and there was a weather event, and it did. There's a kind of combination of man-made human problem and a big kind of environmental thing. So this was a North Sea storm surge which moved up the estuary. So it wasn't just Drypool that was affected. We're pretty sure about that. So next slide, please. The precise extent of the flooding is quite difficult to determine, but we think it, so that's Drypool. So this is Holderness, which is the kind of region around Hull. You can see Drypool there, it goes all the way down to Spurn Point at the bottom right. So it definitely went as far east as Marfleet, and then next click, please, and as far north as Sutton. So all of those places were said to be subject to surrounding by the overflowing of the banks. So it's quite a significant region. But the banks were still not fixed. So they were in poor repair, there was a storm surge, they got beaten through. Summer 1646, so this was March, continued to be wet, and the commissioners were struggling to enforce the repairs. Now, you can think about this period as well. We're kind of still in the Civil War period. Hull is recovering from a couple of very major sieges. And as I explained to you, where the town was deliberately flooded. So they're kind of already struggling financially. The farmers are not getting their crop in, and they are being told they need to pay more tax in order to repair the banks. And then what happened was they started a bit of a kind of argy-bargy about who is responsible for these banks. Who should be responsible for paying for them? So the commissioners said the people of Drypool have always paid for them, and they should continue to do so. So they maintain this line that it should be the Drypoolers. They live next to the banks. They need to be responsible for repairing them. Now, the Drypoolers disputed this, and I'm going to move on in a little bit to talk about some of the arguments that they used. But little surprise to say that in the winter, or can we just go back a little bit, of 1646 and 1647, we're not exactly sure on the month, sometime around November probably, there was another surge, and the banks were once again breached. Now this time, it went even further up the level. So Drypool is there again, and then we've got Hempholme in the north. So the inundation went as high as Hempholme. So it was a very significant flood event that had a very far-reaching impact on the broader level. Now, we are kind of in the middle of writing this paper up, me and my colleagues, and at some point we're going to try and map it properly, but I'm afraid you've got a bit of a rudimentary, here's some arrows on a map, because we do have records of townships and acres of where the flood went. So excuse the slightly kind of basic interpretation now, but we're going to try and kind of get it properly so we can try and work out exactly how far it went. So what's interesting here is that, remember I've told you that the people of Drypool, they're responsible for the barrier. The people of Hempholme have been flooded at this, and they are saying they are not responsible for the barrier. So there's a kind of question here of who is responsible for protecting the lands from the Humber. Should it be the people that live next to the barrier, or should it be the people whose lands are affected by the barrier? So this flooding was significant. We think it was around 6 months that the floodwaters stayed on the land. Residents of Stone Ferry, South Coats and Marfleet, which is just much more down towards Drypool, were forced to live in the upper rooms of their houses or to move temporarily elsewhere. Does that sound familiar? Roads were flooded, water's too deep to pass through, and there is some stories that people travelled to market only by boat. And this obviously had a consequence on the kind of agricultural productivity of the land as well. So here's a quote that said, the high tides washed away much of the fruitful soil, and the rest so muddied and sanded with the ever flowing of the salt water as it is rendered altogether useless, and so barren, thereby as if it be not lost, it cannot be recovered or reduced to the former goodness in many years. So this is not just a kind of temporary displacement of people, but a kind of long-term impact on the financial, capabilities of the region. So I'm going to just finish up this part of the paper with a very brief summary of what was actually a very complicated argument about who should be responsible for this flood and who should be responsible for the banks. Now, I said to you that historically it was the responsibility of the dry poolers, and this was not an unusual principle in early modern kind of governance, early modern land law at that time. If you live next to a bridge, you maintain the bridge. So it's not unusual, but the dry poolers didn't think it was fair. So in 1646, and can I have the next slide, please? They submitted this petition to the commissioners, essentially arguing that they shouldn't be solely responsible. So they argued that where they lived wasn't very fruitful. They said it was a screed of ground, adjoining upon the furious and unresistible arm of the sea called Humber, whose sea dike was assaulted by impetuous waves and surges. So they're saying, where we live, it's hard. We're right next to the sea. It's tricky. And they also said that this risk was getting worse. So they said the shore growing deep and tides swifter. They now needed additional support. So they live next to the Humber, which is kind of violent and forceful, and they're arguing that the tides are getting stronger. Now, this is where my physical geography colleagues get very excited, because it's a bit of a hint into, some of the kind of changing environments of the period. But as well as these changing environmental factors, they also point the finger of blame quite squarely on the soldiers who are quartered in Hull during the Civil War. Now, can I have the next slide, please? So in their petition, they said that soldiers, by day and night, broke and cut up a great part of the woodwork of the jetties and footbank for firing and other occasions, and in like manner took and carried away a great quantity of the timber and plank provided in store for the said repairs. Now, the banks would have had a timber element, so it probably would have been earth on the bottom and then timber on the top. And Hull, like lots of towns under siege or with soldiers during the Civil War, struggled with its supply of timber. So it is not that unlikely that this happened, although me and my colleagues have furiously searched all the records and cannot find any evidence of it other than this petition. So it is a chance that the dry poolers just made it up. But we don't really know. But it is kind of likely to be an effective argument because it's something that soldiers possibly could have done in that period. And it kind of fits with the broader kind of language of petitioning. It's quite a good argument. And this is a rather beautiful interpretation of that event by our artist, Louis, and this is from the zine. It's somewhere in the pages. So that's his kind of version of what happened. Now, like I say, this is a petition. They don't want to be responsible for maintaining the banks. So isn't that surprising that they're pointing the finger of blame on someone else? I don't know if I would be drawn on whether or not this actually happened or not, but it is a good argument. So the dry poolers try to claim that they shouldn't be only responsible. It should be everybody whose lands are affected by the floodwaters, right? And actually that did work for a time. The commissioner experimented with taxing all the way up the Holderness levels. So like in that map I showed you before, townships all the way up north were taxed in order to repair the banks. But there was huge opposition to this because people said it shouldn't be our responsibility to maintain the banks of people down in Drypool, and it didn't work. In fact, they ended up sending the collectors who were sent out to collect the tax, they ended up being sent to jail because they didn't collect the tax. So they got sent to the York jail for failing to collect the tax because people refused to pay it. So what actually happened in the end, and like I said, I'm slightly summarizing a quite complicated story, is that the kind of responsibility for maintaining the banks fell back to the citizens of Drypool. And the commissioners ultimately paid for it themselves. They took out a loan and built a new bank. So a new bank got built by the end of the 1640s. And the burden of the finances for that came from the inhabitants of Drypool. So it reverted back to that kind of traditional model of who is responsible. So lots of things to think about there about kind of the modern context of flooding and flood responsibility, and you might have your own opinions on, you know, who was right in that argument. Was it the Drypoolers? Was it the landowners in Holderness? But I'm going to finish off today. I haven't checked the time. Fine. I'm going to finish off my talk with just a few examples of how we've used some of these stories back again in the kind of present day. So I love petitions, and I did my PhD on petitions. I find petitions a really kind of interesting way to get people to think about being involved in politics, really. So one of the things that I did last summer, I gave them this example of the petition and asked people to think about if they were going to petition government or Yorkshire Water about flooding and water in their area, what would you say? So if you click to the next slide, I've got a few examples of the petitions. Again, super small, so you won't be able to read them. But I printed out a few of the kind of templates. I don't know if anybody here has ever submitted an e-petition. It's actually really easy. You have to meet certain requirements in order for it to be accepted, but it's a very sort of straightforward process. So these were hypothetical petitions, but I don't know, it might have sparked some people to go off and write their own. So we talked about, you know, what do you, so these are, you know, citizens in the past who had their own knowledge about water and how it should be managed and their own opinions. What would you write? So there's a couple of examples up there. And that was interesting. And then another activity I did, so next slide, is I think, you know, archives are really interesting because they tell us what was important to a society. They tell us, you know, what a society wanted to be remembered. And one of the interesting things about learning about early modern flood events is that really you don't actually get a great deal of, you know, how people would have experienced the floods. It's mainly kind of government records, and actually spark the question of, well, what are we leaving behind? What are our flood records that we're leaving behind for the future? What histories are being laid down in the archives of our country about flooding? So we ran this exercise where I asked people, okay, right, we've got an imaginary archive. There's no boundaries. There's no collection policy. Put whatever you want in it. What do you think needs to be remembered about flooding in your town? So if you click through, these are just a few examples. Why was planning permission granted on floodplains? What could we have done better? What decisions were made in the past? Funding, water requests. More selection, but it might spark some thoughts of, for you, what, you know, if you're making an archive of the flood histories of your neighbourhood, what do you think needs to go in? And this theme of kind of responsibility came through really strong. And this was kind of inspired by thinking about the kind of watery archive, the flood archives of the city that I've researched, and then thinking about, well, what flood archives, what watery archives do you think we need to make for the future? Okay, so I'm gonna wrap up now for some conclusions. So firstly, I hope, if nothing else, you've learnt some things about early modern Hull and what it meant to live in a green, blue landscape at that point, and the role that individuals had in managing and living with water, and the way in which kind of experiencing that environment shaped people's lives in the past. And then secondly, about how, so if we can click through, these histories can be useful starting points for thinking about living with water in the future. Now, these aren't solutions that I'm kind of giving you, and it's very much a kind of, well, how do we maybe use these as a launch pad for the conversations? Because finally, point 3, click through, please. A question for you as I end, and I probably don't actually really need to ask this question because I suspect everybody's already got their own thoughts, and I would welcome them in a minute. But what might all this mean for you living your own changing and changeable watery environment today? So how does thinking about kind of history and place-based histories shape kind of your relationship with water today and in the future? That's it. Thank you.
Very much, Hannah. That was really, really interesting, and I just could sense from the room that there were common memories being shared and things that everybody recognised from here with Hull. So there is chance for questions and conversation. If folks in the room have questions or observations to make, can I just ask that you put your hand up and we'll give you the mic. Because then people on Zoom can share in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'll throw it open to the floor and our first question or questions, and we'll probably get some from the techies up on the battlements there from Zoom, I would imagine. So any questions from the room to start with? So I'm going to break the ice. Oh, no. Excellent. We have one. Hang on.